Hello and welcome to Video 8 in Mr. Mormon's Ecology series. Yesterday we learned about all of the different biomes on land. Today we'll be studying aquatic ecosystems.
Nearly three-fourths of Earth's surface is covered with water, so it is not surprising that many organisms make their home in aquatic habitats. Oceans, streams, lakes, and marshes, indeed nearly any body of water, contain a wide variety of communities. These aquatic communities are governed by biotic and abiotic factors, including light, nutrient availability, and oxygen. Aquatic ecosystems are determined primarily by the depth, flow, temperature, and chemistry of the overlying water. In contrast to land biomes, which are grouped geographically, aquatic ecosystems are often grouped according to the abiotic factors that affect them. One such factor is the depth of water, or distance from shore. The depth of water, in turn, determines the amount of light that organisms receive. Water chemistry refers primarily to the amount of dissolved chemicals, especially salts, nutrients, and oxygen, on which life depends. For example, communities of organisms found in shallow water close to shore can be very different from the communities that occur away from shore in deep water. One abiotic factor that is important both to land biomes and aquatic ecosystems is latitude. Aquatic ecosystems in polar, temperate, and tropical oceans all have distinctive characteristics. It may surprise you to know that only 3% of the surface water on Earth is freshwater. Freshwater ecosystems can be divided into two main types: flowing water ecosystems and standing water ecosystems. Flowing water ecosystems include rivers, like we see, and rivers, streams, and creeks, like we see in this picture. They're all freshwater ecosystems that flow over the land. Organisms that live there are well adapted to the rate of flow. Some insect larvae, for example, have hooks that allow them to take hold of aquatic plants and rocks. Certain catfish have suckers that anchor them to the rocks. Trout and many other fish have streamlined bodies that help them move with or against the current. The turbulent water has lots and lots of oxygen, and a lot of the organisms that live in these ecosystems need a high level of oxygen to survive. Standing water ecosystems would normally be lakes and ponds. They are the most common standing water ecosystem. In addition to the net flow of water in and out of these systems, there's usually water circulating within them. This circulation helps to distribute heat, oxygen, and nutrients throughout the ecosystem. And then there are freshwater wetlands, like we see in this picture. A wetland is an ecosystem in which water either covers the soil or is present at or near the surface of the soil for at least part of the year. The water in the wetlands may be flowing or standing, fresh or salty or brackish, which is a mixture of both fresh and salt water. Many wetlands are very productive ecosystems that serve as breeding grounds for insects, fish, and other aquatic animals, amphibians, and migratory birds. The three main types of freshwater wetlands are bogs, marshes, and swamps. Bogs typically form in depressions called kettle holes left by ice sheets that melted thousands of years ago. These are very common on Long Island. Thick mats of sphagnum moss grow in bogs, where the water tends to be very acidic. Marshes are shallow wetlands along rivers. Marshes may be underwater for all or part of the year. Marshes often contain cattails, rushes, and other tall grass-like plants. Water flows slowly through swamps, which often look like flooded forests. The presence of trees and shrubs is what distinguishes a swamp from a marsh. Plankton is a general term for the tiny, free-floating or weakly swimming organisms that live in both freshwater and saltwater environments. See figure 414, for example. This photograph shows phytoplankton. They are green and photosynthetic, like plants. Zooplankton, which are animal-like plankton, which are consumers and need to eat, or we could also call them heterotrophs, and also larger animals called water fleas, or Daphnia. Estuaries are wetlands formed where rivers meet the sea. Estuaries thus contain a mixture of freshwater and saltwater water and are affected by the rise and fall of ocean tides. Many are shallow, so sufficient sunlight reaches the bottom to power photosynthesis. Primary producers include plants, algae, and both photosynthetic and chemosynthetic bacteria. Estuary food webs differ from those of more familiar ecosystems because most primary production is not consumed by herbivores. Instead, much of that organic material enters the food web as detritus. Detritus is made up of tiny pieces of organic material that provide food for organisms at the base of the estuary's food web. Organisms that feed on detritus include clams, worms, and sponges. Estuaries support an astonishing amount of biomass, although they usually contain fewer species than freshwater or marine ecosystems. Estuaries serve as spawning and nursery grounds for commercially important fish and shellfish, such as shrimps and crab. Many young animals feed and grow in the estuaries, then head out to the sea to mature and return to reproduce. Many waterfowl use estuaries for nesting, feeding, and resting during migration. There's two main types of estuaries, salt marshes and mangrove swamps. Salt marshes are temperate zone estuaries dominated by salt-tolerant grasses above the low tide line and by seagrasses underwater. Salt marshes, like the one shown above on the left, are found along great stretches of eastern North America, from southern Maine to Georgia. One of the largest systems of connecting salt marshes in America surrounds the Chesapeake Bay estuary in Maryland. Mangrove swamps, like the one seen on the right, are coastal wetlands that are widespread across tropical regions, including southern Florida and Hawaii. Here, the dominant plants are several species of salt-tolerant trees, collectively called mangroves. Seagrasses are also common below the low tide line. Like salt marshes, mangrove swamps are valuable nurseries for fish and shellfish. The largest mangrove area in the continental United States is Florida's Everglades National Park. Marine ecosystems are the ecosystems found in the open ocean. Marine biologists divide the marine ecosystems into different zones. There's the photic zone and aphotic zone, which are shown here and here in the diagram. Photosynthesis is limited to the well-lit upper layer known as the photic zone. Only in this relatively thin surface layer, typically down to a depth of about 200 meters, can algae and other producers grow. Below the photic zone is the aphotic zone. The aphotic zone is permanently dark. Chemosynthetic autotrophs are the only producers that can survive in the aphotic zone. These autotrophic chemosynthetic bacteria are living at the deep sea hydrothermal vents, where very hot mineral-rich water is bubbling out of the ocean, the seafloor. They use these minerals and heat energy to produce carbohydrates in the same way that photosynthetic organisms use sunlight energy. And they become the base for whole ecosystems around the deep sea hydrothermal vents. You can see in the diagram above that zones are also based on depth and distance from shore. Like the open ocean is here in the deeper part. The coastal ocean is along the continental shelf, closer to the shore. Now the benthic zone, or benthos, would be along the deeper part of the ocean floor down in the aphotic zone. This benthic zone, or benthos, is the ocean floor in the aphotic zone. It receives no light, so you're not going to find photosynthetic organisms there. Here you will find organisms such as sea stars, anemones, and marine worms. Although there's no photosynthesis, there is plenty of life in the benthic ecosystems. They are dependent on food from organisms that grow in the photic zone, particularly the producers. Organisms that die in the photic zone sink down into the aphotic zone and down to the benthos and become food for clams and sea cucumbers and all of the other deep sea dwellers. Organisms that live in the intertidal zone are exposed to regular and extreme changes in their surroundings. Once or twice a day, they are submerged in seawater. The remainder of the time, they're exposed to air, sunlight, and temperature changes. Often, organisms in this zone are battered by waves and sometimes by strong currents. In the picture, you see the rocky intertidal zone of Vancouver Island in Canada. Here we can see barnacles and seaweed permanently attached to the rocks. Other organisms such as snails, sea urchins, and sea stars cling to the rocks by their feet or suckers. Competition among organisms in the rocky intertidal zone often leads to zonation, which is the prominent horizontal banding of organisms that live in a particular habitat. In the rocky intertidal zone, each band can be distinguished by differences in color or shape of the major organisms. For example, a stripe of black algae might grow at the highest high tide line, followed by encrusting barnacles. Lower down, clusters of blue mussels might stick out amid clumps of green algae. This zonation is similar to the pattern that you might observe as you climb up a mountain. In the intertidal zone, however, zonation exists on a smaller vertical scale, just a few meters compared to the kilometers you would ascend on a mountain. The coastal ocean extends from the low tide mark of the outer edge of the continental shelf, the relatively shallow border that surrounds the continents. The continental shelf is often shallow enough to fall mostly or entirely within the photic zone, so photosynthesis can usually occur throughout its depths. As a result, the coastal ocean is often rich in plankton and many other organisms. One of the most productive coastal ocean communities is the kelp forest. Kelp forests are named for their dominant organism, a giant brown algae that can grow at extraordinary rates, as much as 50 centimeters a day. Huge forests of the seaweed are found in cold, temperate seas around the world, including those along the coast of California and the Pacific Northwest. Kelp forests, like the one in the picture here, support a complex food web that includes snails, sea urchins, sea otters, a variety of fish, seals, and whales. In the warm, shallow waters of coastal tropical oceans are coral reefs, among the most diverse and productive environments on Earth. Coral reefs are named for the coral animals whose hard calcium carbonate skeletons make up their primary structure. As you can see in this picture, an extraordinary diversity of organisms flourishes in these spectacular habitats. The open ocean, often referred to as the oceanic zone, begins at the edge of the continental shelf and extends outward. It's the largest marine zone, covering more than 90% of the surface area of the world's oceans. The open ocean ranges from about 500 meters deep along the continental slopes to more than 11,000 meters at the deepest ocean trench. Organisms in the deep ocean are exposed to high pressure, frigid temperatures, and total darkness. Typically, the open ocean has very low levels of nutrients and supports only the smallest producers. Productivity is generally low. Still, because of the enormous area, most of the photosynthetic activity on Earth occurs in the part of the open ocean within the photic zone. Fish of all shapes and sizes dominate the open ocean. In the picture here, the swordfish and octopus are just two examples of the organisms found in this zone. Marine mammals, such as dolphins and whales, also live there, but must stay close to the surface to breathe. Okay, that's it for this overview of aquatic ecosystems. If you have any questions, as always, please talk to me in class tomorrow.